joining. I really appreciate it. Today is, as Maggie had said, the third in our three-part series. And I'm going to go ahead and just get us started in the interest of time. So we talked in our first couple of sessions, why generative AI and the VMO, preparing better prompts, talking about what the first 90 days are. Then we went through and dig deep a little bit for the first phase about what we would use GenAI for to help roll out our Agile VMO. Then our second session, we talked about those next 30 days. Today, we're going to talk about the final 30 days of a 90-day, three-phase rollout. Some caveats and cautions. So as I often say, I like to get everyone really excited about using this technology, rolling it out, and I'm going to totally kill the vibe. So not really going to kill it, hopefully, but you get a Ferrari, you want to make sure you know how to drive fast and around those corners. I'm not sure that I can give everyone a Ferrari, but that metaphor hopefully works. If you've got a powerful tool, you want to make sure that you know how to use that powerful tool in the best way. And then some ideas on moving forward. So that's what we've got today in a very compressed period of time. My LinkedIn is in the chat. I think I'm connected with a number of you. I would be more than happy to connect with anyone else to continue the conversation. I won't give you my abbreviated resume here other than saying I've been doing this for a long time. And I did work for an artificial intelligence company, not generative AI, but for about 6 years, doing a lot of product management and UI UX work. And a lot of what I'll talk about is informed by really understanding those aspects of the technology and where it's great and where it's awful. So, and I actively use generative AI for real world tasks today. So as those of you who haven't been through a session with me know, I have a generalized allergy to theoretical. I want stuff I can use. So in less than an hour, my hope, if I do this reasonably well, is you walk out of this session with things that you can do later today if you choose to do so to get this going. That's the standard that I'm trying to hold myself to. I hope that's why you're here. We'll go ahead and get started. So I want to do a brief overview of the last two sessions. The first that's really important, and this isn't unique to the VMO use of generative AI, it's really important just in any use of generative AI. You will find that, to get the best outputs, you want to have good inputs. And so think in terms of these ideas when you do your prompts. And I'll give you some example prompts that will show this in action, but the role. Specify the role you are or the role that you wish to emulate. So that's who I am, and I interact in different ways, and we'll see some examples. Also, who's the audience? That's not monolithic, and that's one of the superpowers, I think, of generative AI is same content oriented towards different people. How I communicate something to an executive versus a technical expert for the exact same item, the same question, the same concern. The way that I articulate that, with or without generative AI, needs to be different. I don't want to use language of executives with technical people and vice versa. So know the audience, and you can specify that in the tool to get the right sort of better outputs. Context is always, always, always important. So provide that context, your answers that you get back from these tools, and anything that it provides will be far more useful because it will be surgically oriented towards your context. Format. So this has gotten a lot better since I first started talking about this a couple years ago. You can have tools like ChatGPT and its ilk generate artifacts for you and actually have them available. Word documents, PowerPoints, etc. So specify the format rather than copying and pasting into it. And then length. Numeric constraints explicitly don't always work, but you can give some guidance. So I often say, 500 words or 100 words or 10 bullet points, whatever that might be. But be specific in your length. Again, rather than trying to edit, this is what I did for a while, rather than trying to edit what's coming out of it, tell it exactly what you want and need. You'll still probably have to do some manual manipulation, at least that's been my experience, but let it get you 75% of the way there, and then it's a lot less work to finish that last bit. Related, garbage in, garbage out. So if we want better outputs, again, not unique just to the rolling out your VMO, but in the use of these tools, irrespective of the particular flavor that you use, make sure that you are putting in high quality prompts. Make sure that you can get more accurate, relevant, and useful results by having those well-crafted prompts. And again, I'm going to show you some real-world examples for your VMO, but use that idea whenever you're using these tools. If we use clear prompts, we're going to get more consistent results. One of the things that I've really struggled with personally about using these tools is that they're different than things that most of us have experienced before, where if we say with these inputs, I can test a system because I know that I'll get these outputs. And that is not the case with generative AI in many cases. So the more that we can be specific and have these better prompts, we're going to have less variability and not get just some of those weird outputs. And I'm not talking about the system really going sideways and hallucinating. I'm just talking about better prompts will get us to more of what we expect and want for those outputs. Bias and errors. Again, these tools are trained on readily available, publicly available information, which means the biases that human beings have and perpetuate online are perpetuated in these tools. It's our job to make sure that we're mitigating that bias and those errors as much as is possible. And then again, context, context, context. The more context you provide, the better you're going to get in terms of those outputs. So again, absolutely useful for what we're talking about today, but useful more broadly than that. So what did we talk about? So the first phase, days 1 through 30, we talked about engaging with our stakeholders and how GenAI can help with that. We talked about how generative AI can help us with defining our vision and our objectives, can help us with starting value stream mapping, and then in our selection of tools to help us roll out and support our VMO. So days 31 through 60, our second session, the initial rollout of the VMO, we talked about how generative AI can help us with forming teams, looking at our skill sets, looking at our current org chart, especially if we're in a traditional PMO moving towards a VMO, understanding what is a good path for the people who are part of our PMO today. How do we transition them into our VMO? Where would they best go? Where would they best be supported and best support? That's really important when we're looking at changing the organizational structure in people's jobs. Setting up lean portfolio management. This is really difficult for at least any organization that I've ever experienced in terms of making this transition. So how generative AI can help us with really setting up LPM and helping with those prioritization scenarios based on real world data. Designing our governance framework. So again, if we're going from a traditional PMO, it's a governance body, and a VMO is a different type of governance body, but it's still governance, just the same way that people sometimes think Agile has no rules. No, it does have rules. They're different. The intent is different. And the way that we approach that is different, but we want to have a governance framework. Our VMO has some very important governance functions. How do we help establish those in a way that's appropriate for our context and our organization? That's really unique to us because every organization truly is unique. And then finally, as part of our VMO, we're going to do PI planning or big room planning. So how can we use generative AI to help those scenarios? So those are the 8 things from our past 2 sessions in terms of some of the key areas that we walked through. If you weren't able to join those first 2 sessions, or if you just want to revisit them to see them all in context, the videos are on YouTube. I think Maggie may have already shared the links. If not, I know that we can and we will. But it's really good to look at the entirety of that across these 3 sessions that we've had together. So those are days 31 through 60, the initial rollout. So what can we do? For those of you who were here for the last session, I did a bit of a recap on how we follow up past that first phase, right? So the idea, we've done our first 30 days, now we've done our first 60 days, those first 2 phases. We need, as anyone who is in agile ways of working, we always want to inspect and adapt. That's really core, not just to our practices, but to our principles. How are we constantly assessing, no matter how good our plans were, no matter how good our work was? We want to stop after we've implemented that first piece of it and reflect. And is it accomplishing what we wanted it to accomplish? Is it doing what we need it to do? So here's a couple of suggested actions to follow up from phases 1 and 2. So again, it's not one and done. As we go through this, we need to stop and really objectively reflect and say, how well did this work? Do we need to do some different things? Do we need to do some new things now? Do we need to course correct? Was it a great idea, but maybe we didn't implement it well or something else happened? But to hold ourselves accountable, we really need to pause before every time that we're rolling out these phases, we really want to stop and say, the first month and now the first 2 months, how are we doing with those things that we established and what do we need to iterate and improve upon? So using generative AI for these follow-up steps is, again, a really valuable use of the tool. So the first, if you saw those 8 items on those prior 2 slides, engaging stakeholders. So generative AI, as you now have 60 days worth of time that you have rolled out a number of these efforts, use it to analyze those meeting notes and the emails that are sent and sent back, Teams chats, other things, to get sentiment understanding, to look where there's engagement gaps, and then to start to really get a better understanding. We had this thing where we rolled out communications to our stakeholders and we engaged them in the process. Now that we've got 30 to 60 days since we've started that, let's take a look and see how that's working and then tune what we need to do, refine it. Define those OKRs. So let's see how we're doing evaluating clarity and alignment of those drafted OKRs. Let's take a look and let's make sure that they're clear, that we don't have any duplications, if there's any strategic disconnects. See if there's anything that we need to do, again, not to change our OKRs, but to refine them now, again, that we have some real time where we've been rolling out the remainder of our VMO and we've had some complementary efforts that are happening on the strategic side. There can be some things that we may want to tune in terms of those goals, time frame, metrics, whatever that might be. But use generative AI to help understand whether we have issues with clarity and alignment, et cetera. Initiating that value stream mapping. So analyzing JIRA data now that we've got 30, 60 days worth of data available potentially. Analyze whatever data that we've got to start seeing. And I'll show an example of this, by the way, in the examples for phase 3, but to look now that we're starting to make these changes, now we're starting to have some data that's emergent. It's going to be relatively new. 30 to 60 days worth of data is not always going to be reliable, but it's likely to be directionally accurate. So let's go ahead and look at that and let's see where we have flow constraints or other issues, and then start attacking those items to improve our overall efficiency. One of our first items was to select an appropriate tool. So now that we've really looked at a tool and started looking to really determine which one we'd like to do, or we've maybe already chosen one and started using it, let's take a look at those capabilities now that we have real data in the system to see if there's configuration changes that we might need, or there's other things that we might want to do, again, to reflect. And then often it's not material changes, but tuning, either course corrections that are minor or incremental additions. So something's going well, let's add to that, let's amplify it, etc. So now forming teams, the second session that we had. So now that we've started this process of forming teams, let's take a look at the team composition and skills. Let's see if we need to do a better alignment to the existing or new VMO roles. Start to look for, in the real world, where we have gaps and suggest some training or onboarding needs. Again, we did that first round and we formed some teams based on the data that we had. Now that we've got people potentially placed in those roles and starting to work, the real world is going to help provide us some course correction that no matter how good our original intents and plans were, and that's part of why we're all proponents of agile ways of working, right? Is we can only do so much with theory and planning. We really need to assess based on what we have delivered and the interaction from our users, our customers, our organization. So once we're in the real world, then we can start making those changes based on what's really happening in the real world. Setting up LPM, so using GenAI to help score epics or features using WSGIF. And then also, and I think this latter part is really useful, simulating prioritization scenarios based on business drivers. And I showed a little bit of that last time, but that's really an area where these tools can really help, especially if you're in an industry that is fairly ubiquitous, so banking, consumer banking, those sorts of things. The ability for it to envision scenarios and give you some good guidance based on different scenarios, it's a superpower, one of the superpowers of these tools from my perspective. That idea of designing or refining our governance framework. So now that we've started rolling out that governance framework, we want to draft and revise governance charters. generate RACI charts based on really areas where there's often, I say, as you move to a VMO, you're going to find a lot of role ambiguity. I'm a big fan of RACI charts, even if they're old school. GenAI tools can be incredibly helpful with starting to build out those charts and really being helpful in clarifying how we work together, but really who is responsible and accountable, most importantly. And then big room planning, so generating those planning agendas, facilitation guides. And then as we start to actually go through that process, we've scheduled it in that last session, but if we're going to actually do our next BRP or PI planning in the next month or so, if we start to have a good idea of some of the work that is being contemplated, some of those epics or those MMPs, pre-read summaries, other things that were post-event actions from our last session, GenAI can help with all of that to make sure that our next big room or PI planning is as effective and valuable as possible. So those are some follow-up actions that we've got here. So now on to our regularly scheduled program, the last 30 days, to how do we optimize and scale? How do we keep, again, building on these building blocks? We built that foundation, that secondary piece, with a 90-day rollout where we actually, if you follow these steps, can have your VMO up and live, at least in some functional way in real use in your organization in less than 100 days. What do we do in the last 30 days, and how does GenAI help us to make this happen? So start measuring what matters. One of the areas, both principles and practice to me, that's really important is for our VMO to truly be focused on moving from that P in the PMO to the V in the VMO. The V is for value, right? So we need to start measuring value. We need to start understanding what value is. So when we want to start measuring what matters, the metrics that we're going to start looking at are going to likely be different than the metrics that most organizations are looking at today. It's a fundamental shift in terms of where we sort of shift our gaze. Improving our improvement. So again, now that we've got 60 days worth of time, let's take a look and look at our retrospective data, see what some things that we can do now that we're rolling out our VMO, not just at the team level, but really at the overall portfolio level, because we are concerned not just about the individual product teams and the individual value streams, but we're concerned about the overall portfolio and how are we doing from a portfolio management perspective. The other thing, and I told Maggie this earlier, Maggie Spivey, if you've not been in a session with me, you will find at least one picture of an owl for a question, or one picture of a kitten looking either confused, scared, or really happy. So this is your one kitten picture. It's the only one I have, I'm sorry to say. But I have to do that in every deck. It's really important. You all have seen a lot of PowerPoint, so I try to keep it as fun as possible. Shifting the culture is really important as we roll out our VMO. So I think those of us who have been through any sort of transformation, but especially in a sort of agile based transformation, really moving towards value, anything related to that, we all know that the tooling is pretty easy. It's easy to roll out Jira or ADO. We all know that processes are relatively easy to follow, but the way that people think, we can tell people about limiting work in progress, but it's really difficult for people to really take that step to limit it. So shifting the culture is really key. And if we want our VMO to be rolled out effectively and to be sustainable, we have to make sure that we're always focusing also on the cultural elements. And then scaling. As we've rolled out those first 60 days, we need to start thinking about how do we start scaling across other value streams. So that's what we'll talk about for most of the remainder of our time. So the first is tracking our value delivery. So we can begin tracking metrics like cycle time, CSAT, or return on investment for our value streams. How can we use GenAI? Well, and all of these, as I had mentioned earlier, if you look at the depth of that prompt, and what I talked about those 5 different characteristics that we want to be thinking about as we create better prompts, I've got that persona in there. I've got a lot of detail and context. The more that you can do this, the better your prompts will be. And I will also say, and I think I mentioned this in the last session, maybe ironically, maybe not at all, if you're not sure how to craft better prompts, you can actually provide some context and then ask whatever GenAI tool you use to help you refine your prompts. And that actually is a fun way, if you're not yet familiar with this, to have it kind of give you some training wheels until you get accustomed to it. But here in this scenario, act as a data analyst. So I'm specifying the role or persona that I am, specializing, not just a data analyst, specializing in agile metrics, design a dashboard to track value delivery metrics. It's given me some specific examples. It provides, though, again, that surgical precision, the new client onboarding value stream. And then again, as I had mentioned before, like commercial banking as an example, there's enough data out there in these models to train these models that when I say use industry standard choices based on this general process for financial services organizations, I provided that in my prompt to make sure that it is really using. This is not an area where I really want to get creative. This is a problem that the world has solved, and financial services specifically have a way that I think that I would like to align to. I don't want to be creative in this. I really want to at least start with what are standard expectations of the metrics that matter. But I'm specific about my industry here as well. That's part of that context. And then the remainder of this suggest visualizations, but how does that sentence end? That highlight progress towards business outcomes. So in this really, really long paragraph, though, I've got all of this guidance so that the information that I get, and I'll show you the response, really gives me exactly what I need. So that better quality prompt got me better quality outputs. So dashboard design, new client onboarding value stream. It talks about those objectives, and then it starts to provide. Now, again, it's not building out the dashboard for me, but it's saying these are the things that it would suggest that I include in a dashboard. So system agnostic, it's not actually building the dashboard for me, but it is providing to me the things that I should include. And I would say, like what I say with all things Gen AI is you want to really thoughtfully, actively evaluate. That's really our role as we use these tools as a co-pilot. We want to evaluate these outputs, and I never take anything from Gen AI as 100%, but sometimes I get 20% of value, sometimes I get 90. But the better the prompts are, the closer I get to that 90. But these are good answers. This is a good, so end-to-end cycle time, throughput, flow efficiency, and CSAT. If I didn't have generative AI and one of you just came up to me and you said, what are some things that you would have on a dashboard when we want to talk about value at the portfolio level? I mean, honestly, these would be the four things that I would have said. So I like the way that it has responded to this, and I thought that was incredibly helpful. But it also tells you what type of visualization that you would like. And as silly as it seems to say that's a high value thing, for me, and maybe for a lot of you, if you think about dashboards that you look at, if you look at a dashboard for 30 seconds and you can't tell what it's saying and where you need to maybe focus your gaze in terms of an area of opportunity, to me, that's generally a failed dashboard. I want a dashboard that I can look at and I can understand visually where things are. So when it says, for example, for my CSAT, use a bar chart and line, bar chart for volume and then line chart for the trending over time. Those are the sorts of things that I think are really valuable. Maybe I just intuitively understand that I want to track CSAT over time because it's really the changing up or down of customer satisfaction. But if I just have that for current month, that's not super helpful for me. So it provides the guidance not just about what metrics we want to capture, but explicitly suggestions on how you would use dashboard type elements to visualize properly, again, with the idea of making sure that that is capturing your intent and telegraphing what you want it to telegraph as cleanly and as clearly as possible. Relatedly, though, so that's how we would build a dashboard and some of the contents. What I also like to do is to use these tools. This is obviously not a dashboard, but if I put in my real data, and some of the tools, by the way, and this is changing so rapidly that I have to update this deck every single time I do it, but a lot of this, the AI guided analysis of information in systems like in Jira or elsewhere, they're building this into a lot of tools. So what I'm saying is, irrespective of what platforms you use, if you've got some data that you can dump out of your tracking system, you can do things like what I'm showing you here. You may have this functionality available in the tools that you have, so you can check there first, but most of the vendors are changing almost daily from what I've seen. Jira certainly is changing with AI features very regularly, and they're getting better. But in this instance, I just took some data and I dropped it in to help me with the last 90 days of my actual real flow metrics. And so it did some averaging. It also showed me, and this is where, again, I like these tools. They do some of the analysis for me. They show me like upper and lower bounds for that average cycle time. But based on the context, it's not just summarizing information for me, it's identifying areas where we likely have some issues. And you can see that, especially on the notable variance column of that of the last column in that table. So from that, it provided this additional set of responses and details. So it provides that analysis, and it provides some insights. Now, again, it has as much context as it does from the data you're providing, but in these instances, it's at least trying to make some hypotheses, or it has some suggestions. So this first one, VS4 is high performing, but heavily reliant on a single team, indicating potential fragility. I didn't ask it that. All I asked it was to look at that data, but it provided this to me proactively. And again, that's one of those superpowers. It can suggest things that I didn't even think to ask for, which is great. Aging work in progress signals flow bottlenecks. You can look at those different items, but it provided those insights to me without me saying, hey, take a look and see difference between these different value streams. It's doing the work for me. I still need to figure out what to do about that, but it's at least helping guide me to better understanding of the data that's available. And then again, from here, whether I choose in any of these instances to do verbatim anything that it says, all of those 4 things, additional things, half of them modified, whatever that is, you as the humans, us as the humans, still need to make the decisions about what to do and how to do it. But these are good out of the box suggestions from my perspective. So with aging alerts, setting threshold-based alerts for any item that's greater than 10 days in progress, that makes a lot of sense to me, and something that I don't have today, embarrassingly, and I should. We look at WIP limits and we have ways to light that up, but I don't have a dashboard that specifically says anything that's more than 10 days in progress. And automating that and sending that to Scrum Masters and VMO linking pins. So again, once I create that filter in Jira, I can do that in a couple of minutes. I can have that set up as a subscription. That's great. I mean, virtually no effort to do that. There's some value there that's pretty clear. So that's pretty awesome. I won't go through all of the rest of these in a lot of detail, but you can look at what it's suggesting. All of these are practical, non-theoretical. Dependency management is another one. These are things that we can do. And if you look at the suggestions, they're actually, well, the last one might be a bigger one, but for the most part, these are things that we can do without a whole lot of churn, without a whole lot of additional work. Those are the sorts of things that, other than perhaps item 4, the first 3 of those are things that we could do fairly quickly and tactfully. The 4th one is going to be an initiative, and that would be one that we'd have to say, do we think it's worth the work doing? But that said, it's still a good idea. So that's what generative AI can do for you. In less time that I've taken to walk through the slide, you could have those suggestions. So the next is improving our improvement. So now that we've been rolling this out, and a continuous improvement is both a principle and a practice for Agile and Lean teams. After retrospectives that we do after each sprint, and especially after the big room planning events and product releases, let's take all of that data and look for some improvement areas. So here's an example here. And again, if you look over in my screen cap, these are all real prompts with real just screen caps of the response from ChatGPT. This, by the way, and Maggie, if you wouldn't mind, the Agile VMO GPT that Sanjeev and LitheSpeed created, if you would be so kind, if you don't mind throwing that in the chat. This is a custom VMO created by president and founder of our organization. It's available in the custom GPT store in ChatGPT. That will give you even more tailored guidance specific to rolling out a VMO. So I would highly suggest that. But I'm using that for these examples. You'll still get good quality content if you use other tools. But this is one that I'll show you these exact examples I got from that custom GPT. And I think the overall quality of them, because it is designed for the work that we do, you might find that if you can use ChatGPT. I think GPTs now, I believe, are free to use for any. You don't have to pay $20 to monthly for that plan. Try that out. And if you're not sure, do it, side by side test with whatever tool you use, Grok or Claude, Copilot, whatever the case may be, and do the same prompts and see the quality of the outputs. But I think for anything related to VMO, the custom GPT is quite good. So in this, you're an Agile coach conducting retrospectives for teams working on a new AI-enabled mobile banking application. Again, very specific. I'm not just saying, hey, I'm a coach conducting retros. I'm providing a lot of detail that's going to help inform my the response that I get back. So small regional credit union analyzed this retro data such as lead time, defect rates, and team feedback to identify actionable improvements, recommend specific changes to reduce waste or improve flow efficiency. Some of you who may be Agile coaches, delivery leads, Scrum Masters today, you may be thinking, hey, this is not unique to the VMO, and you're absolutely right. Even at the team level, this prompt would work quite well, and you can use that same idea. We want to look at it more broadly for our VMO, but that prompt can be useful for any kind of retrospective. So as we look at this based on the data that I provided, again, so I can dump a Jira CSV, there's other ways to get at this, but what it came up with based on the data that I provided, just the Jira issue data, was looking at, it found some issues with the AI stories and that it was delaying delivery specifically because of access to folks on the data science shared services team. And that was an impact. And then some recommendations. So again, it doesn't mean that we do this recommendation at all. Maybe we do a variation of it. Maybe we do something that's completely different, but at least it gives us some ideas. And if I didn't like these, I would just say, give me some other ideas. Give me 5 more recommendations for item 1. And it will. And to me, that's part of what I practice a lot and you might find useful is you become more of a curator in a lot of these instances where you're really going through and you're looking at 10 options and saying, I like these 3 best. The second, improve story definition and flow efficiency. So here's another one. I don't know that we're necessarily going to start doing BDD if we haven't done BDD yet, although I am a fan. But at least this helps, we can really still use the construct of given, when, then, if that can help us with our acceptance criteria. And then the idea of definition of ready checks for the AI features. This is good guidance. I mean, I would just say if a senior coach provided this to me and said, this is what I think we should do, I'd look at that. And based on the data that I had, I would say, this seems really solid. Let's give this a try. Here's some other ones that it provided: quality improvement, early AI testing. So again, it identified issues solely from the data dump that I provided. It was able to connect those dots that I just really don't see other reporting tools having available. And then make some recommendations. Again, what does that look like? Encourage early engagement between QA and data science teams on AI model behavioral testing. So I might want to continue to interact with the tool for that and talk about specifics. Right now, encourage early engagement is kind of too amorphous and vague for me, but I like the idea. So again, like a conversation, what do you mean by that? How might we do that? Keep that process going. And then next steps for continuous improvement, it's got some other ideas there. So I found that, like, out of the box, those were really great, practical, implementable. I don't need to buy new tools. I don't need to hire new people. It doesn't take a long time. These are things I can do now. And again, for those of you who've been through sessions with me before, I really just want to know how I can start improving what I'm doing, what our teams are doing now. I don't want a plan that involves having to wait 90 days to figure out how to start that. I can start all of these things right now. Shift our culture. Now, this one, we can start now, and then we never stop, right? So we know, those of us who are in Agile ways of working, we know the culture really is the hardest part. The tools and the processes are relatively easy, and I do say relatively, right? They're not easy, but compared to changing the way that people think and the mental models they've had their entire career, that's what we have to change, and that's not easy, and it's not one and done. So we want that agile mindset. We want this idea of that people have as muscle memory, emphasizing flexibility, wanting to really be collaborative and learning across teams. So here's my prompt as an organizational change consultant tasked with promoting agile principles across teams in the customer service and billing departments. Develop a cultural transformation plan that includes training content on agile values, workshops on collaboration techniques, and communication strategies tailored to resistance points. So again, that's a really densely packed prompt, but that level of detail and specificity is going to get me and get us what we want out of this tool so that we can really have something that we can start immediately implementing. This will take a while to implement, obviously. That this is not an easy, we can do this in an hour, but we have to start somewhere, and this is going to give us that concrete list so we can start doing some things now. So again, that prompt was specific to non-technical teams. We talked about those different areas. So customer service and billing team members, supervisors, and department leaders. So again, the context of who is part of this organization is really important. This is not going to be agile and lean training for people who are on, software engineering teams or QA, et cetera. We want to provide the Agile Values program to people who are not technical and aren't going to be. So you can look then, it's the core training and content, the mindset and principles, and then where that context that I provided gets woven back in here. Agile values applied to service and billing workflows, and talking about shifting from transactional to relationship-driven service. So again, we're not just talking about the manifesto and the principles. We're talking about to this audience, zooming specifically into them, the work that they do, which is not the work that we do. The work that they do, how do we get them to connect with agile ways of working in terms of the mindset behind it more than the practices or the tooling? And then from that, it provides and on top of the training content, et cetera, it provides a guideline for an implementation roadmap. So again, I look at this and in many cases, it's like, no, that's a good starting point. I don't know if phase one awareness can be done in month one. If it's a really big org and there's a lot of change and there's a lot of sort of bureaucracy, for lack of a nicer word, that might take longer. If I'm doing this in a smaller organization and I've got a lot of agency about rolling these things out, when last time I was brought in as a CTO, I had a lot of ability to control and move towards an agile way of working because it was my teams and I was the one who was able to help get us rolled out that way. So in those instances, I don't know that I would wait for a month. I would have that done in 2 weeks of that. But anyway, it's a good starting place, and you can continue to iterate through this, or you can copy and then modify to your own context details. But interacting with the tool, I find often is more useful. So if you can say, I have control over rolling this out, we can do this more quickly. It can suggest a different roadmap. So again, a lot of that ongoing iteration with the tool, just like talking to a person. If you've got some new ideas, or you need clarity, or you want some additional guidance based on something you liked, if you were talking to a human, if I was talking to you and you said something and I'm like, that's awesome, tell me more. How would I do that? Same idea. I don't like anthropomorphizing these tools. I think there's some danger of treating them like they're humans. But if we think about the construct of how humans communicate, we don't deliver everything at once. We interact based on what we're understanding and hearing. I think that same approach is really useful with these tools completely. So then the last of this, before I get into the caveats and cautions, is scaling value across value streams. So how can we, as we start to incorporate more value streams, how can we use GenAI to help us? So again, different role here. You're an agile consultant and scaling expert, helping expand VMO operations to additional value streams in the loan servicing department. I'm specific about who I'm onboarding. Provide a step-by-step guide. I'm telling it, I want a lot of details. Don't be general. Don't be lazy. To onboard these value streams along with current other organizational areas, like as part of the VMO. So I'm providing a lot of context there. And again, include existing resource forecasting techniques based on workload analysis from existing streams. And again, a lot of detail, very densely packed prompts, but I get some good things in response by putting in that level of detail and context. So from that, it provides this as its response. So for this new value stream, confirming that organizational alignment, reviewing the enterprise goals, align onboarding objectives to key outcomes. Again, if I hadn't seen this and I was just talking with one of you and we said, hey, we want to do this, these would be some of the first things I would ask or talk about doing. And probably for those of you who have done this before, you would say something similar. So it's really good to know, especially if you've not done this before, which is really who this conversation is for. For those of us who want to roll out our VMO and it's just sort of overwhelming, this is like having an expert that you can work with to help you roll that out. So that was the first piece, conducting that stakeholder engagement, assessing the current state of loan servicing, forecasting resources based on the information that we've got, refining that portfolio backlog and budgeting. So again, pretty solid list. You can also see for those of you who are counting, we go from 1 through 3 and then 8 and 9. So there was other stuff in terms of its response, very detailed and useful in terms of those things. So these are all of the things that I can do to get this rolled out in terms of incorporating new value streams effectively into our VMO. And I think it's a pretty solid, both breadth and depth response for that. So from there, some caution and caveats. So the first is ethical and compliance considerations. The first is data privacy and security risks. So my examples have been with financial services. With financial services, we are dealing with a lot of data that is confidential, GDPR, probably not HIPAA in that one, but CCPA, the other alphabet soup. But if we're passing protected information, we need to make sure that we're careful about how we're dealing with that data and if we're able to even put those into these tools. Also, as mentioned before, this idea of bias amplification. So if we are not cautious about what we are doing with the outputs, again, we don't want to just copy and paste. And I see so much of that. And I think some of us have seen these horror stories about lawyers who have been sanctioned. I don't think anyone's been disbarred yet, but using AI for citations and coming up and it hallucinated and put data out there that was not actually accurate. We want to really make sure that we're thoughtful about these responses in the same way, although that wasn't about bias amplification. But since these models are trained on data from humans and humans aren't always well behaved, consciously or otherwise, we need to be thoughtful about those responses and to make sure, especially when we're talking about things like staffing or funding or risk assessments, that we're not unintentionally amplifying a known bias that would be problematic. So we have to really be careful with those outputs. And again, we are the ones who are the curators. So we really have that obligation to make sure that we are using what we get thoughtfully and properly, and that we're assessing it to make sure that it's accurate and useful and usable. So some mitigation tips especially for those sensitive data exposure issues or otherwise. Work with InfoSec and compliance teams early to establish those safe usage guidelines. So we really want to know, some organizations already have a policy, hopefully most do by this time. When I first started talking about this, many organizations didn't, or they simply said, you can't use these tools. And the reality is that the data shows that whether or not people are allowed to use these tools, they're using them. And so let's go ahead and accept that that is a reality, and to make sure that we know, for example, can we only use Microsoft Copilot for some of our data because it's incorporated in our organization and there's controls that are already there through what Microsoft is doing? That's going to really vary based on your organization, its policies, and its context. But seek out those folks and make sure, if you don't know what those standards and those requirements are for your organization, to understand what they are. And if they don't exist, that's also a good opportunity to say, these are some things that we want to start using these tools for. How do we make sure that we've got the right guidance in place to make sure that we're using them properly? And then related, and this really can at least be a way to start. Now, there's some potential downsides to this in terms of some of the examples that I showed you. So depending on the data that's in your Jira exports, for example, how easily you could anonymize that, or to have it on a non-sensitive data set. There may be some scenarios where until that issue is resolved, you shouldn't use the tool for that purpose. So those are the sorts of things that are, again, very context specific for your organization, but that's something certainly to be thoughtful about. And the best thing if you're not sure is to ask questions, and also to make sure that you turn off the improve the model option. By the way, that is the at least officially published way with these tools. They use different language, but basically ChatGPT has one that says improve the model for everyone. Claude has something I think that's fairly similar. Perplexities, I forget what it's called, but in each of the tools, they opt you in to sharing your data to improve the model. Go find that before you do anything substantial and turn that off unless you really do want your data to be part of that data set. But that's one of the first things that you can do until you are sure that you have a solid process in place that aligns with your organization's security, especially if you're dealing with healthcare or financial services data. Please, 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 in those areas, those are very important and highly protected data elements, and we want to be really thoughtful about how we do that. Generative AI in the VMO launch, so some caution there. Again, AI is not autopilot, it's co-pilot. Generative AI should augment human expertise, but again, you or your team, someone in your organization or someone's preferably, are going to be assessing those outputs, and you have to have a critical eye towards that. Because one of the problems that I mentioned in one of the last sessions, probably every session, is one of the things that I learned when I was starting to work for a generative AI company that had a chatbot that was natural language processing and then would respond as a human, as a chatbot, is chatbots, when they're wrong, generative AI or non-generative AI, chatbots, when they're wrong, have no humility. And some people don't either. So there's probably a joke there, but we don't have that kind of time. The tools will look confident in terms of their responses, even if they're absolutely wrong. So you have to know how to look past the veneer of accuracy and expertise. In some cases, the guidance is just plain wrong, and you're going to have to be able to assess that. Over-reliance, again, without the human validation, also can misalign with organizational strategy and customer needs. If you're in the financial services space, but there's something that is really unique about your organization, maybe it's a regional credit union, like in my examples, versus one of the top 5 banks nationally or internationally. What our goals are could be materially different, and so we really want to provide that context and make sure that the responses, again, are aligned to your needs and context, and be very careful with that. But even if you provide that level of specificity in your prompts, make sure that you are assessing those outputs to make sure that they're accurate. So an example risk here: AI-generated OKRs or prioritization recommendation may lack nuanced understanding of different factors, and have these AI human checkpoints within your VMO to make sure that those AI-driven outputs are appropriate. I will say, for example, like I've experimented, we talked about it, I think, in the last session, for using these tools for using WSGIF and prioritizing the MMPs or the epics. To me, that was interesting for things that it had enough information in its model to assess. But there's going to be other epics that are very much company specific, and the idea that it could understand business value or time criticality or operational efficiency, like, it may not have enough information to be able to calculate those properly. So that was an interesting exercise, but we really want to take a critical eye to it because it's going to look professional. It's not always. Change management and culture. So again, the human side of this is really emotionally, politically, insert whatever other words you'd like here, and the answer is yes. there's a lot of risks and there's a lot of reward in these tools and using them responsibly. But people are worried about, and this is perception of job displacement, but the reality is that there's likely to be some material changes in displacement. And we need to acknowledge that that's a reality. That's going to cause concern to people, though. And so if people see these tools as, robotic, a little robot here, they may resist or reject anything that's generated through these tools, if they're impersonal or detached from that context. So some things we can do. Again, I like the language of Copilot. I think that that's very helpful, and not just to use that label, but to use that concept or that construct. Make sure that everyone has AI literacy, especially within the VMO, to make sure that there's confidence and trust and also effective use of these tools. And then have change champions from portfolio and delivery tool teams to model AI positive behaviors. All of those are things that you can do to help make sure that you're adopting this in your organization. Again, not just for your VMO, but throughout the organization, so that people use these tools in the appropriate way, with really limited risk and downside. So moving forward, these are all things that we've talked about so far. But these are, again, if you haven't started yet, within 90 days, I feel like an infomercial. I'm not trying to be, but maybe I am. These are things within 90 days, your money back, it's free. Within 90 days, these are things that you can do. So joking aside, if you want to get started. Within 90 days, you can have your VMO up and rolling. First, define that vision and strategic objectives. Second, engage and align those stakeholders. Third, accelerate value stream mapping and process insights. 4, automate governance and reporting workflows. I cannot overstate the importance of starting to measure things and share those metrics with people. No matter whether or not you use generative AI, if you don't have metrics in place that show the impact of things, you will be at a substantial disadvantage. So get that going fairly soon. Enable AI-driven continuous improvement. Again, we're Agilists. We're proponents of Agile principles, even beyond tooling and processes. So we want to apply that, as I mentioned earlier, here as well. Constantly, as you're using these tools, use these tools to help you reflect and to help you understand how to course correct, because you're all exceptional. But even with that, it's hard to do this 100% perfect, especially with a small team, maybe just a team of one. Some of you may be doing this largely on your own initiative. Make sure that you're using these tools to help you with that load, including doing analysis of a lot of data points to see really some things that you might not see if you're in the midst of all of this. Prioritizing that lean prioritization and adaptive funding. You can't have a VMO if you're not changing the way that you fund and prioritize the work. So use it to help with that process. It's 1 o'clock. I'll close with this: build AI literacy and foster change readiness. So with that, we are at time. We are at the end of the presentation. Thank you all for joining.